Good afternoon and welcome to BroadCAST, the webinar interview series of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Academic Success and Transition. I'm Dan Hutt, and we couldn't be more delighted to have with us today novelist and director of UNL's Creative Writing Program, Timothy Schaffert. Professor Schaffert, it's a great honor to have you with us here today.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me.
I've got 101 questions for you here this afternoon, but before
I only have 3 answers. So.
You only have 3 stock answers. Before I dive into any of that, though, I wanted to mention an anecdote told to me by a mutual friend of ours, TJ McDowell, formerly of UNL and now doing great work in the Lincoln Mayor's office. But when I mentioned to TJ that you would be a guest on BroadCAST, he told me about recent experience where he selected your recent novel, The Perfume Thief, for his book club. And he contacted you, not knowing you, on the offhand chance that you might be willing to set in via Zoom with the book club. And instead you said, well, I could come in person. And not only that, I'll drive down from Omaha to do it. That speaks to your extraordinary kindness and character to do something like that. Those people will never forget that again.
It was fun. It was a lot of fun. I appreciated the invitation, and yeah, I mean, if somebody's going to read my book, I'm happy to talk about it.
Oh, I wish I had been there. Now, and book clubs will come up again before we finish here today. Now, to begin, I know that you were raised on a farm in Hamilton County, about 150 miles west of Omaha. What was the closest town to where you grew up? You grew up on a farm.
Yeah, about a mile. It was only about a mile and a half outside of Aurora. So
Aurora, okay,
yeah,
very good.
So my farm was in between Aurora and the interstate I-80.
Very good. Do you recall some of the children's literature that you enjoyed growing up as a child?
Yeah, I mean, I loved Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I grew up loving Roald Dahl because he wrote stories for adults too, often with a twist ending, which was sometimes sometimes landed well, sometimes not so well. But yeah, I would say Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was a huge influence. And then the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, they would play. I think they played it like every Easter when I was a kid.
Yes,
and they'd even changed. So in the book, there's I can't remember. There's some sort of manufactory that in the movie they've made into eggs, like a kind of. So I wondered if that was an effort to make it a kind of holiday movie, but
yes,
but yeah,
I remember that as well.
Yeah, and I loved The Secret Garden. I thought that was a great book. I have to confess, I read a lot of comic books. That was really pretty much the attention. The most of the literature I read was of the comic book variety.
Do you remember how old you were when you first started to write creatively?
I don't actually. I mean, I feel like I always was writing to a certain degree and drawing. I loved drawing, and I would even write in my comic books and in my book, which I suppose isn't that unusual for kids to just start scribbling in their books or any blank space. But I loved just the act of writing, just putting pen on paper. And so, that evolved into to just, and I still have this very particular about the pens that I use and the paper, and I feel like it has an influence on the creativity ultimately.
Absolutely. Now, how old were you when you first thought of being a writer when you grew up, when you conceptualized of that possibility?
I feel like I was pretty young then too. I mean, I think I was thinking in terms of children's books when I was drawing and writing, and so we had a lot of books in the house, and so I think that was always an idea that was kicking around in my head.
Okay. Were you a student at Aurora High School?
I was.
That's where you went to high school. Now, did you always know that you were college bound and or coming to UNL?
No,
Mhm.
I mean, nobody in my family, I had two older brothers, and
Mhm.
nobody in my family had gone to school, and so beyond high school. So I think it was something that was instilled upon me and expected of me to a certain degree because I did okay in school. And
Mhm.
so I think there was a sense that I should continue that on. And by the time I graduated from high school, it was my parents could afford it in a way that they couldn't so much before that. So, or at least afford to get me moving into the to college and all. I did work while I was in college.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, it was something that until I was actually there, I don't know that I necessarily knew that that was where I would go, or even if I would finish.
Right. Were there other schools on the table besides UNL as far as where you would attend?
I thought about going to Doan when I was
Mhm.
because I was in theater
Mhm.
in school, and and they would have theater days at Doan, so I became familiar with the campus, and so I was attracted to that notion of going into theater and going to Dome, but Dome's a private school and it was too expensive. So
Yes. Yes. Now, were you an English major as an undergrad?
not at first. I started as a journalism major,
Ah,
and
okay.
yeah, and was actually a journalism major for most of my time. So I was doing an English at the time. You could do a major. You could major in journalism, then you had to do these concentrations. You either did 3 12-hour, did like one 12-hour and a 24-hour, and I did a 24-hour concentration in English. And so I had a lot of credits toward English already. So at some point, I was responding more to my English classes, especially my creative writing classes. And at one point decided I wanted to get an MFA. And so I
Mhm.
just, even though it ended up taking me longer, I spent another year in college beyond my 4 years. I did switch to English ultimately.
Where did you live at when you were at UNL, your freshman year?
I lived, is there a dorm called Able?
There is.
Yeah, I lived I think I lived on the top floor of Able Hall.
That explains a lot, Professor Schaffert, because you're as a free-thinking writer, it's known that all of the troublemakers come from Abel Hall, and so
I,
that sort of
I think that was the
independence.
reputation then too.
Yes, I think that's true. Yeah, I lived in Harper Hall,
Oh,
which is a
okay.
little more toned down, but a bit
Yes.
rowdy, perhaps too. What was it? How would you describe your undergraduate experience at UNL? And what was it? I know that you worked with Loris, the UNL English undergrad literary journal. What was it like working for Loris and with people like Cinnamon Dawkin as well? I know that you worked with.
Yeah. And Cinnamon was in a couple of the English classes I was in too. And so and there were others that you would see show up in the English classes, and you'd end up getting to know them and their work and their writing, especially in the creative writing classes. So I think once I moved into more seriously into English, as a journalism major, I was jealous of the English majors because it was kind of like, oh, they get to read books and they get to write things, they get to talk about books, and I'm doing this other thing, which is very task oriented. It felt like,
Mm-hmm.
and so finally, I'm just like, well, why am I denying myself that opportunity? And and so yeah, so once I switched to English, I felt much more within um, the realm of imagination that I wanted to be in.
Right.
And
It felt more natural, perhaps.
yeah, and I was just more engaged in the topic, and
Sure.
I became a more serious student, I think.
Sure. Cinnamon, of course, being a proprietor of a Novel Idea bookstore downtown. When's the last time you were in a Novel Idea?
Well, it hasn't been too terribly long, I don't think, but
Yeah, it's not a good idea to stay away for too long. That's
no.
my notion. But did you enjoy familial support in your selection of initially a journalism major in college? Was that something that your family got behind?
They, I think so. I mean, it was. Uh, I mean, they wanted me to do what I cared to do.
Hmm.
I think they would have I think they wanted me to do something that would lead more directly into a job. And so that was part of the reason journalism appealed to me, is because at that time they had a real strong internship program. And so it seemed like they were really committed to helping escort their students into some serious professional development. And so I felt a sense of, that it was, I guess it offered some safety, maybe, and
sure.
And considering that I was uncertain about how I was actually going to pursue a job after college, but then I ended up switching to English. But that was also because I had a better sense of the next step from English too, because I knew I wanted to try to do a Master's of Fine Arts program.
Now, students at UNL know when they matriculate, know going in that they'll take lots of courses outside of their chosen majors, outside of their discipline. And we talk in CAST about how that contributes to making one more well-rounded. Do you recall which courses outside of your majors were most impactful for you as an undergrad?
I guess I would say I loved the art history classes that I took. And I think I still remember aspects of it, and part of my own relationship to the visual arts today is drawn from that instruction that I got as a student. And so I felt like that really complemented my education as a writer and reader. I think I didn't perform so well in the science courses.
Me neither.
And I think some of it too, and I don't know if this is still the case, but when you're coming in as a freshman, you're in large lecture halls, and it seems like it's easy to get lost. And especially for someone like me, I really did get lost. I really did feel like I was just, just another student in this large group, and I didn't feel any real connection to the class beyond whatever I was going to give to it myself. And so that ended up becoming a detriment, really. I ended up getting lost in that experience. And so I didn't do so well my first year, and considered not continuing. But and I think that's part of the reason why the English major ended up appealing to me too, is because those are smaller classes, and you do connect with your teachers, and you do have conversations with the students.
That's true. I can speak to that from personal experience. Absolutely. We speak sometimes in CAST about the perspective from students today towards higher ed is more towards HIRE ed instead of HIGHER ed. And sometimes students don't appreciate those courses on their schedules that they might deem impractical. And on the one hand, of course, that's understandable, that all the economic constraints about going to college and universities becoming more commercialized. But college is supposed to be more than just job training, isn't it?
Well, I think you should come from your college experience changed to a certain degree. I mean, I think you're going to be exposed to new ways of thinking and new ideas and new histories and philosophies, and you're going to be engaging with people from diverse cultures and communities, and so you do grow in that environment. And so I think that ultimately, when you go on the job market, in most cases, they're just asking for a degree and some experience if you have it. And so once you can gain some experience, that degree, no matter in what area it is, should be in service to you if you're focused in that way. I mean, I think that you can have all the job training in the world, and if you don't know how to move forward with it, or resist it to a certain degree, then it's not going to serve you in the end. But yeah, I think that what something like an English major does is that it contributes to your insights into communication and how to engage people with ideas that might differ from yours, or that are similar to yours, or just like the way that you can look at a situation with more complexity and sophistication. And it's not necessarily something that you're taught specifically, but it's something you pick up. I mean, it's through the exposure and and having that time in college to think about these things. I mean, you have the rest of your life to think about your job and to think about, the whatever skills you need to develop, especially if it's in a field where your skills are changing and the technical details are changing, and you have to, re-up your certification and all of that. I mean, so this, a four-year college is really a way that that you can engage with the world in a larger sense too, not just in terms of your job, but in terms of how you're going to think about the world and how you're going to process all the complex information that comes your way.
And English it really is great that way, isn't it? It's the quintessential liberal arts degree in some ways. And it teaches you how to think in large part, I believe. And it's much more than, I mean, a lot of students will say, well, what am I going to do with an English degree if I don't want to teach? But it really is something that you can plug into a lot of different areas, isn't it?
Yeah, and you can go forth into the world with to demonstrate, comprehension skills and writing skills, and especially, I mean, there's so many new dimensions of technology that are developing that call upon people who can write and can think in terms of communication. And I mean, the sort of robots that we're dealing with online, the chatbots and such. I mean, they're designed to be, to solve problems and to engage with the customer, engage with the client, and that calls for a certain level of insight into how people talk to each other, and that's an insight that you gain from reading books and from watching movies and theater. I mean, so I think all of those elements of just to reduce it down even to the level of dialogue, to no dialogue, is something that's there are pathways, and there's need in the world, in the professional world, for people with those kinds of insights and sensibilities.
Surely. Now, coming back to that issue of selection of college major initially, does it just come down really to following your heart, regardless of how impractical others might make it out to seem sometimes? I'd like to refer to a line in your novel, The Swan Gondola, if I may, from 2014, a line that I've always liked, and I'm taking something out of context here, but I think it speaks to what we're talking about. The line goes, "It seems to me that if you quit ventriloquism to write about how to knot a necktie, you'll soon enough be writing about how to knot your own noose." Am I way off base in my interpretation there? But it seems like it's important to follow your heart in that sense.
Oh yeah, I mean, you get so much. I think, especially young people, get so much pressure to think practically, but I think sometimes our sense of what the practical is very narrow, and I think that it's if you're passionate about a subject, then and you pursue it with great interest, I think there are rewards and dividends to be got from that approach. But yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine putting yourself in a situation where you're pursuing something that just doesn't speak to you at all. That's part of the problem, is that sometimes we don't know what it is that we want. I mean, when we're in college, we're trying to figure out, and that's part of the benefit of being able to, or being required to take other courses and engage with other colleges and other departments. I mean, you might discover something in that process that really appeals. I mean, to a certain degree, I wish that I had done even more of that. And, I was just dismissive of the sciences, but I think if I had, had different or perhaps better opportunities in that direction, it might have lit something in my imagination too, in that regard. I mean, the world is vast, and the opportunities are vast, and their interests are vast, and so it can be overwhelming. But at the same time, it should speak to the fact that that you can find your way. You can find that particular seed of interest that's going to draw you in and can serve you for the rest of your life.
Well said. I was probably more appropriately said terrified of sciences. when I was an English major at UNL. I exhausted all of my pass, no pass credits
Yes,
towards
did that too.
those classes. So in any case, now having been an alum of UNL, being an alum of UNL, and now also working here for many years, what significant changes do you notice in UNL as a whole, or the English department, or in students today from when you were an undergraduate?
Well, I guess there was certainly discussion of diversity and inclusion when I was a student, but I don't know how much of that was actually being put into motion. And I mean, we can look back and observe that it wasn't dealt with as aggressively then as it is now, as we're recognizing inequity and recognizing that the university needs to make a better place for people from a variety of races and cultures and backgrounds, and for people of different sexual orientation and different gender. It's just it's those conversations, I think, are richer and more meaningful now, perhaps, than they were then. But they were certainly meaningful then too, and I think that was. That my experience in the English department really spoke to that and really prepared me in a particular way for being conscious of my social surroundings.
Right. I want to come back to that point a little bit. The English department at UNL is different than other departments in a lot of ways, and in the sense of being sensitive to some of those important issues. I'll touch back on that in just a minute. Now, you mentioned you recognized at some point that you wanted to get an MFA degree. How did it come to pass that you went to the University of Arizona, and what was that like?
So I had a couple of good mentors in the English department. Judy Slater and Jerry Shapiro, especially, were
great mentors.
Yeah, they were my writing teachers, and they were also. I think when I started taking writing courses as an undergraduate, I didn't really know I'd be studying with people who were actually practicing writers. I think there's even a sense that like the short story form was antiquated. I guess because in my school all the textbooks were old, and so all the stories were old. So I thought it was just this dead form. So I learned in these classes about literary journals. I learned about MFA programs where these studio programs where you could go and write and study with other writers, and that's who they were. I mean, they were writing and publishing their work, and so I learned from them about the potential of an MFA program, and they encouraged me to apply for them. I applied. I was kind of lazy. I mean, back then you actually had to send away for materials and everything to be done through the mail. And so I don't know if I would have been any different if it was online, but I kind of waited to the last minute, and I think I ended up applying to, and it costs money too. And so you have to budget for that. And so I think I ended up applying to maybe only 3 or 4 schools, and they provided me a list of what they thought were the best schools, and I only got into one of them, kind of University of Arizona, and I didn't get any funding. I didn't get an assistantship, and so I wasn't going to go. But then I thought, well, my parents thought I should go, and I had some money saved up, and they loaned me a little bit of money. So I thought, I'll go for 1 semester and at least just take this class with a writer I wanted to work with. But then once I got there, I got this scholarship that made it less expensive, and I did some work, and so I ended up staying there. And it was a great experience.
It's really wonderful that you enjoy that sort of familial support to take a leap like that. That's important. Not everybody has that.
No, I was very fortunate. I've had a lot of opportunities in my life that through support from family and friends.
Professor Schaffert, what is the writing process like for you? What inspires you? How do you begin to create? And where do you go? Where do you do most of your work?
Um, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, like sometimes a kind of suggestion of an idea will occur to me, and I'll think, oh, well, that might be kind of an interesting novel or an interesting character, and then that provides a kind of filter, I guess, for my brain, a framework, and then other things come along and they might attach to that idea, and so the novel builds itself in pieces like that, I guess. I mean, where I start thinking about, well, this character it has this quality, but then there's this other character, and then there's this incident that seems like it would be in service to all of that. And so that can sometimes all start coming together pretty quickly, or it might take a lot of wool gathering, and a lot of thinking about it. I do a lot of pacing around, and so or if you read a newspaper and that'll suggest something, or sometimes even watching or reading a book, there'll be a plot development, and I'll think, oh, but what if it hadn't gone that way? What if it had gone this way instead? And so I think there's all kinds of stimulus from around you that you can draw from and adapt and frame and reshape according to your own imagination.
Do you feel like your writing is does it have a didactic element to it, or is it more personal expression, or how do you see your work?
I guess it really is based in the imagination. I mean, it's hard to it's hard to say whether I guess I've never really, it's hard to articulate clearly, but I don't know that I've ever really thought that I had a particular purpose in any of it. You know, something, like I said, that I've always done, and it's something that I like being in that imaginative space, and I like words. I like putting words together. I like creating voice. I like not just having the image in my head, but like figure out the words to describe it and to capture whatever atmosphere and ambiance that I'm after. So it's to some degree intellectual engagement, but also imaginative engagement that that serves me ultimately. I mean, when I was a kid, and this is maybe, I never really know how to talk about this, but I had I had head trauma as a kid, which isn't terribly unusual for children, but I was young enough that I don't really know what the cognitive effect of it was. But I sometimes wonder if that's why I have almost like a critically bad attention span. And so I think there's something about that attention span that ultimately, I mean, fortunately has not been terribly detrimental. It has affected me in the way that it can affect people, but I do think it perhaps contributes to that brain space I go into, where I just fall into a trance sometimes.
And I wonder, you mentioned creating voice, and I know about your theatrical background too. It must be really interesting to be able to play the roles of the different characters in your work in that sense. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of like an actor getting into character.
Yeah,
You're trying to get a
exactly.
sense of who they are and how they'll respond to a situation and what they'll say. And if you've written something, or a line, or a perspective that doesn't fit, that doesn't seem right for the character, it really kind of announces itself as something that's that is out of character. And so
Right.
that's something I think you're looking for in the revision process a lot of times, or as you're writing, is this really in this character's voice, and is this really a fit with their perspectives?
Do you consider that your theatrical background has contributed to your ability to do those sorts of moves in your writing?
To a certain degree, maybe. I think just an interest in plays and in drama and in movies and TV shows. I mean, I think probably from that I've picked up dialogue, and but I think also just from listening to people talk. I mean, when I was growing up, my grandparents would be at the house a lot, and they'd tell stories from the past, and I was one of those kids who just wanted to be with the adults and just wanted to eavesdrop and listen. And part of it is because of the stories themselves that were being told, but also just watching the way people interact.
Mhm. Mhm. Now, I want to come back again to the Swan Gondola, if I may. Just, I'm a huge fan, one of the finest novels I've ever read, and I teach in the Nebraska Promise program as well. So we're very conscious of Nebraska history, and the Swan Gondola from 2014 is set in the 1898 Omaha World's Fair and just has exquisite historical detail. Uh, at the same time, it includes some elements of magical realism. I think it's fair to say. Are those components freeing in some sense as you write? I mean, when you abandon earthly assumptions and go down that path, it seems like it might open up some otherwise restricted plot areas. Is that true at all, those magical realist components to your writing?
Yeah, I mean, and especially in the Swan Gondola, I mean, part of it is the setting was so suggestive of magic, and that was the intentions of the architects of the fair, and the midway and the showmanship and all of that really was designed to surprise, and it was those expositions were a glimpse into the future, and so the idea was to marvel people and and to help them see the potential, to see the possibility that might exist in the future, and the direction that inventions were going and all of that. So so it ended up being a really rich territory for a kind of story that's just on the edge of reality and magic. And so I wanted
Right.
to, I wanted to kind of use the elements of the fair that that were real, but actually that had a magical quality, I guess. And so ultimately, I think everything in the book that happens could actually happen in real life, but but uh, but there's something about the belief of magic, I guess, that the characters have, that informs then their sensibility and the narrative itself.
Absolutely, and you're right. The setting of the fair itself is a player therein too, right? It intrinsically is made for that sort of thing. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, I'm curious, does the just exhaustive, massive amount of background research necessary to write compelling historical fiction, is that enjoyable for you? And what's your background in history? Did you have good history instruction in school, high school or college level? Or are you more self-educated when it comes to history, would you say?
I don't recall having any particular attention to history in my
Mm-hmm.
education. I think that is something I picked up along the way. Um, and yeah, I do. I love doing the research, and I love especially going in and trying to find things that haven't already been exploited by historians. We want to
Mm-hmm.
get some kind of historical detail that suggests something about the state of the world at their specific place, or the um, uh, that is particularly unique and helps me create a fictional portrait that's nonetheless in service to a more obscure detail or obscure moment in history. So yeah, and I love dipping into like the New York Times archive. I subscribe to newspapers.com, which I could just, you find what you're looking for on the newspaper page, but then you can look at all the other articles around too, and that informs your sense of the time that you're writing about. And
Of context, yes.
yeah, and with I mean, it's different writing about the Paris of the past, which has been incredibly well documented around the world, and an Omaha of the past, which is much more limited in terms of the historical perspective you can get on that. So I was using old issues of the Omaha Bee, which I could access. You can look at the actual newspaper page
Mm-hmm.
through the Library of Congress, through the Chronicling America project, which University of Nebraska was actively involved with. So so yeah, that was enormously helpful to be able to look at not just the articles, but also the advertising, and to get a sense of
Mm-hmm.
any magazine from the past. So much can be communicated through the advertising, because then you get a sense of what people's sense of luxury was, or what their concerns were, what were the advertisers trying to appeal to, and I think that offers an additional level of insight.
Is that background legwork as enjoyable for you as the writing itself, would you say? I mean, with your recent novel, I read that you did exhaustive research on the history of perfume for the Perfume Thief as well. We take those sorts of intricacies for granted as readers, but for you, that's an exhaustive amount of work.
Yeah, and I could have done more. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I guess it is as satisfying as the writing itself, and you feel like you could just you feel like it's never satisfied. Your curiosity is just never satisfied, and the more that you look, even if you hit dead ends, you think, oh, but there's got to be something else, there's got, and you find usually just a snippet enough of information to keep you going, and so you feel like you could just that thing that you can't even articulate it is that you want. It's just right over here if you just spend a little more time and keep looking on. So yeah, it's I do get into it, and I certainly end up digging up far more than I actually use in the fiction.
Sure. What is it about fiction that makes such a palatable and compelling conduit to learn about things like history or philosophy or political theory in ways that nonfiction isn't? I learned a lot about the 1898 Omaha World's Fair and Nebraska history through the Swan Gondola. And why should one read a novel like that as opposed to just reading old issues of the Omaha Bee, as you said? What is it about fiction that just has that sort of compelling magic to it?
I mean, I guess you probably, I mean, I don't know that you can necessarily look to every historical novel as insights into the world that it's portraying. I mean, I think I've read some historical novels which are pretty banal, or they seem to have gotten all their historical information from like a 30-minute PBS documentary or something. And so it doesn't necessarily tell you anything new about that period in history. It doesn't necessarily tell you something that you couldn't get from a Wikipedia page. So it's not always going to be the best avenue to learning about that time and place, but the idea of seeing people reacting to history, thinking about how that historical moment relates to our own historical moment, I think that's that appeals to our, I guess, our sense of drama. I mean, that's what I'm always talking about with my writing students, is that I'm always telling them to turn up the heat, to bring more friction to the page, and to and so I think that the temptation with writing history is that just by describing the historical moment, historical details, that then you've done your job, but you also need to serve the components of drama to engage the reader and to keep them reading through.
Now, you are also co-editor of Zero Street Fiction, which is a new LGBTQ plus literary series with the University of Nebraska Press. And the series title originates with poet Allen Ginsberg's reference to Lincoln's O Street. By the way, I heard Ginsberg speak at Kimball Hall in the early 1990s. You might have been there as well at the time. How did you decide on that title for the series, and what meaning do you wish to invoke therein?
Well, I've been aware of that poem for many years. I'm not sure when I first became aware of it, but and I've been teaching intro to LGBTQ literature in the English department for a while, and I've been bringing in elements of our English department's own history with LGBTQ literature. And so, yeah, Ginsberg's visit to campus in '66 and then in the '90s, this was all particularly in the '60s, when he spoke openly about his sexuality. And that became part of the conversation of his visit. And in the aftermath of his visit, there were other conversations. And so it seemed a really rich historical moment. And I just, I like the sound of it and the idea of it.
I do too. I think it's fantastic.
He did it. So he published that poem. So he gave that poem to the editor of Scrip, which was the undergraduate literary magazine at the time in the English department. And Steve Abbott, who was the editor of Scrip and went on to become a pioneering gay journalist and cartoonist and writer in San Francisco. So when he was a student, he solicited this poem from Ginsberg, who read it at his reading. So he wrote it on the way, and because that was the thing that Ginsberg did, was this auto poetry. And he'd also written a poem about Wichita when he'd just been in Wichita, Kansas.
Yes.
And so the poem was published as titled Auto Posey to Nebraska. And the administrators at the time, the faculty advisor, said, no, you can't publish the poem. It's not by a student. And so you can't publish it in the student magazine. So what they did was they just made a Xerox copy of it and stapled it. And so every time somebody bought a copy of the magazine, they would stick the Xerox copy of Auto Posey in Nebraska.
That's funny.
Well, that's the only, I think that's the only place that poem in that particular iteration has ever been published, was as
Is
that
Xerox.
Right? A different version of it appears as part of, he put it with the Wichita poem and ultimately titled it Wichita Vortex Sutra, which is how it's regarded now. And Zero Street makes an appearance in that poem as well, if I remember correctly.
You couldn't have picked a better title. It's really fantastic. Now, is the wide variety of work that you do therein as writer, educator, editor, that must be really gratifying to be able to do that variety of work that you do. Now, would the commercial pressure of just being a novelist be tolerable, or do you enjoy that variety?
I've thought about that. I mean, it seemed like when I was younger, so I published my first novel 20 years ago. And so, and I didn't get very much money for it. And I didn't get very much money for the next one. And so it just didn't strike me as a terribly viable approach to life to scramble together. I mean, I did do freelance from time to time, and so I did make a kind of scrappy living. I worked as a newspaper editor for a short time, and but I guess I just didn't think that I could make enough money from writing books, and I just don't have the brain for figuring out what's going to sell, really. And so
are art and commerce unhappy bedfellows for you therein?
No, I mean, I think
not necessarily.
No, I mean, I think some. I mean, and I know people who have had bestsellers that were literary and serious, and so it's within the realm of possibility that you can write from the heart, and you can write with artful intentions, and also have a good business sense, and have some luck and have some money coming in from that. But a lot of stars have to align for that kind of opportunity, and so it just seemed like I would always it didn't feel like a viable choice for me to just commit fully to the writing.
Do you still feel the same way today?
No, I mean, I feel like maybe I could make a go of it. It's I think that I could, if push came to shove, I might be able to
Mhm.
but it would require a particular level of career attention that I don't have to
Uh-huh.
give to it, by nature of having a job. So um, uh, there's more structure to actually having the university job than if I was trying to figure out how I was going to move along book by book.
And there must be aspects of your, so to speak, day job that are pleasing for you, that you enjoy.
Oh yeah, I mean, I love teaching. I love working with students, and uh, and talking about writing. And so yeah, it's a terrific job. So yeah, if it was a job I didn't like, then I might
Right,
be more
right.
tempted to figure
Sure.
out some way to make the writing work as a regular income.
Are your students aware that you're a critically acclaimed novelist as such? Do they mention it?
Sometimes it comes up. I mean, I don't know
Excuse
that.
me.
I think most of the time students don't. I think that a lot of times they're like me. They take these classes not really thinking that they're going to be taught by people who are actually practicing writers, and um, so yeah. So I think that I think it's in some instances if the course has been recommended by somebody else, or if they've you know seen me speak or something, then they come along knowing something a little bit more about my career. But
You mentioned earlier your background in art, and I've outside of some of your writing, I've seen some of the candy wrapper art that you've posted on Twitter, and I just found out that that is part of the Perfume Thief book club kit, which is just a magnificent idea. Have you been a drawer involved in art as long as you've been involved as in writing?
yeah, oh yeah. I mean, it's always kind of
Yeah.
gone hand in hand. And I mean, I remember when I was a
Uh-huh.
kid, I would go to the library the library in town like once a week, and so I at one point, and I loved looking at illustrated books, and so I would go
Mhm.
to the children's section for and make my decisions based on the art really. And at one point, I brought my books up to the desk. The librarian said, "Well, you're too old for these books." And so she took me to the next section of the library, which had no illustrated books whatsoever. And so she said, "Well, here, read this and read this and read this." And so I'm like, okay. And so I took them home, refused to read them. And part of it was that they were, I don't think they were probably the best choices for me to begin with. I mean, they were quite, the stories, I think, were from like, so this would have been in the early 1970s, and she was recommending books that were written in the 40s. So
Yeah.
I think that I just wasn't um, all that excited about them. And so the next week I brought them back and I sort of haughtily threw them back at her. And she said, "Did you like them?" I said, "No, I didn't like them." And so I went right back to um, the children's book section. And
Good for you.
so yeah, and comic, like I said, I loved comic books and I drew a lot of those. But I mean, I've always done some. I think that I was probably a little more frustrated with the drawing than I was the writing, and so I wasn't able to really get it to look on the page like I wanted it to. And there was something about writing that was an easier translation.
Surely. You're one of the directors of the Love Library and UNL English Department exhibit, Unkissed Kisses, LGBTQ plus literature and the 150 plus year history of the University of Nebraska. First of all, it's one of the finest exhibits I've ever seen in Love
Thank you.
Library. It's just outstanding. And it really does an extraordinary job of demonstrating the long-standing LGBTQ plus advocacy of the UNL English department. Is that advocacy common among English departments in the US? Do you believe they're in?
I suspect that there's some level of activism and innovation and social consciousness in English departments across the country. And
Yes.
but I think probably I don't know that universities in general are the most progressive places. I mean, we tend to think of them as needing to be that's their responsibility, and that that's their mission. But there's also systems in place that have been in place for decades and decades and decades. And so you think about how much change there's been in the world here in the 21st century, but how so many of the systems of academia are exactly the same as they've been for many, many years. And so I do sometimes wonder why we're so mired in some of these creaky old bureaucracies that actually probably inhibit real change and real progress. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think in the instance of the English department that I'm in, and this recognition of being pioneering in terms of LGBTQ studies, which was really the efforts of one man. I mean, that was, Professor Lou Crompton had this idea, he pursued it, he really built the course, he did everything right in terms of getting it to be the first course of its kind to be offered by a state university in the way that it was offered. And so I think that a lot of the progress that you see within a university is because of the individual people that commit to certain aspects of it and commit to the level of activism that it requires. And so I don't know that he had that much, that much support from the university or the English department. They just kindly didn't step in his way, and so, or at least not to any large degree. So, but I think that legacy that followed was really about individual faculty and staff and students that have kept it alive, and more so than any kind of university or departmental commitment.
I see. Professor Schaffert, take us into your library at home. What are your own literary and artistic tastes, reading, music, art, film? Do you read more fiction or nonfiction? Do you have desert island books or records that you would consider?
I read a lot of student work, actually. So
I'm sure you do.
We have so in our PhD program, which is we have a creative writing PhD, which is unique in the United States, and that people get an English PhD, but they do a creative dissertation and they take creative writing classes. And so our students write novels and books of poetry and books of short stories. And so
it keeps you busy.
Yeah, so I'm reading a lot of novels, not just the dissertations and the theses, but also in terms of the students in my class are working on projects, and with Zero Street now we have a great number of manuscripts coming in as well. So, but yeah, I mean, so when I'm not reading those, I end up reading a lot of historical research. So I've been reading a lot of guidebooks to Paris from the early 20th century for the book I'm writing now, which is also set in Paris, like The Perfume Thief. So, so that's, but yeah, I love, I feel particularly warmly, I guess, towards the modernists and those writers who've been inspired by the modernists. So I love, and Southern writers. I mean, Tennessee Williams and William Faulkner and Eudora Welty, and then writers like Toni Morrison, who was greatly inspired by Faulkner, and Edward Jones, who wrote this the Pulitzer Prize-winning The Known World. One of my favorite books is Stanley Elkin's The Magic Kingdom, and Virginia Woolf. I've always taken a great deal of inspiration from her work.
What are your tastes in music, if I may ask?
Oh, wow. So, I mean, I guess it's hard to say these days because your machinery kind of makes decisions for you.
Yes, that's right.
So sometimes I'm not even sure who it is that I'm listening to or the name of the song. I just have it in my device. And so, I like jazz. I like classical jazz. I like R&B. I like the kind of slower R&B, and so that tends to be what ends up on my mix as I'm
I'm curious if you're a collector of any kind, or if things like first editions are important to you in our digital world today. And I want to pull a line from the Swan Gondola, if I may, once more. It was human nature to grow attached to a possession. In fact, it was inhuman to have no affection of any kind for the pieces of your life you carried around with you. Would that apply to you as well?
Yeah, I'm trying to get a little less attached to the junk that I have. And so I did recently, so I lost a library book. And I mean, I know it has to be around here someplace. I didn't just throw it away. It was just, and I tend to keep all my library books in one place. But as research that I was doing for the Perfume Thief, and at some point it's gone astray. And so I was tearing this library apart, just book by book, trying to find it in my office at work. And so in the process, I did end up culling some of the books, and just, I mean, this was just, I had not just these bookshelves which go around two of the walls here, but also piles and piles, stacks and stacks of books at the base of the bookshelves too. And so I just finally grit my teeth and determined which ones I could live without. But yeah, that's the thing about doing research too, especially in terms of the Trans-Mississippi Exposition and the Omaha, on eBay, looking for artifacts and items that would communicate something about
yes,
it, and the souvenirs and the postcards, and I felt like there was much to draw from in terms of the atmosphere of the fair from these various materials.
All of that fascinates me. Now, you mentioned being early on a fan of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I know that you're a fan of The Wizard of Oz as well, and that's the opening scene of Swan Gondola as well. And you mentioned, I read at one point, the annual viewing of the Wizard of Oz film on TV. I experienced that the same too. Did you know the book as well as a child? And have you ever considered what the Wizard of Oz might have to say about education?
I did have the book as a kid. After I think I fell in love with the movie, and so but I don't know that I've thought that much about the role of the wizard in education. I mean, I guess, of course, there's, if I only had a brain, right? So I guess, but I think what captivated me about The Wizard of Oz, it's a very mysterious movie, and it's strange. I mean, its iconography is strange, and it's and it's interesting to think about the different ways of portraying the characters, and the way the movie interpreted them, the role of color even, and
yes,
and this notion of these fantastical notions, and the idea that she was in the movie, she's in Kansas, but then the wizard is from Omaha. Now it gets confusing in the movie because I think at one point he says he's from Kansas, but then the balloon says Omaha.
Omaha, yes.
I think that all captured my imagination too, because growing up on a farm in the middle of Nebraska, you feel like you're just in the middle of nowhere, and that nobody knows about you. And so anytime that the culture would reference Nebraska at all, you'd become curious. And so that's
sure.
So eventually I'm in thinking about the wizard, and thinking about that he started in Omaha, and that balloon went up, and like, well, why wouldn't it? It seems natural that it would have been part of the exposition.
Sure. What are the best and worst parts of living in Nebraska for you?
Oh, I'm sick of winter. I have to be honest with you. I don't love winter. So, but and I think that sometimes there's a kind of small-mindedness that I get frustrated with, and so that but I mean, that's there's trouble all around, right? I mean,
sure.
the world is in conflict everywhere. So what I like about Nebraska is that it's been affordable for me. You know, I think that there's this attraction to the big glamorous city and its restaurants and its culture, and but that all costs. And I'm not somebody from money. I don't have a trust fund or anything like that. So I've always been, you know, I've always kind of hoarded my money when I've had it. So so I think there's something about that practical sensibility that the state speaks to. And I do think it's beautiful even in the winter time, you know.
Sure. You mentioned that you're at work on a new novel, also set in Paris, and I was going to ask you more about that. What projects you're currently working on, and what lies ahead for you artistically?
Yeah, so I'm working on a novel that's actually by the Paris bookseller, and so it starts in the action really starts in 1912, and then carries us a little bit into World War I, and then the next part is set in the 1920s. And so it's about this. It has a kind of you know, the Truffaut film Jules and Jim. So it's about two men and a woman who develop this friendship and love affairs, and so it's so yes, I've and since a lot of it takes place in this bookshop and it's from the point of view of the bookseller, I've been learning a lot about bookselling in the early 20th century and bookmaking, and again, Paris. I mean, the Perfume Thief is set in 1941 in Paris, and so it's a somewhat different world, not a radically different world in 1912 in Paris, but different enough that I have to reacquaint myself with the city in that regard.
That sounds fantastic. I love bookshops. That's Cinnamon will attest to that.
Yes.
as well. But as we close, Professor Schaffert, what I know you do this for a living with your own students, but what advice would you give to aspiring novelists?
Oh, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, it's tough. There's a lot of competition. I mean, the business of it is a little different now than it was when I was starting out, because people can ultimately publish their own work. And if they do it in the right way, they can sometimes have great success at it, depending on the kind of thing they're publishing and the way they go about it. But I think above all, it's you have to care about the work itself. I think I never really know what to say to students who just want to be published. I mean, because that's going to be a long, hard road, because there's a lot of people who want to be published, and and even though there are a lot of books that come out every year, that's only a fraction of the number of books that are submitted to them. And so, yes, I think as long as you care about what you're writing, you can commit to it, then you can actually persevere in the way that you have to. I mean, there's a certain level of resilience that writing takes, and you have to become accustomed to rejection to a certain degree. And it's not a rejection is not demonstrative of the work's quality necessarily. I mean, it just means that particular editor decided against this particular book at this particular time, and so so I think. I tend to think in terms of there's the creative aspect of it, which is very enriching and very inspiring, and serves is, you know, more than just a means to an end. I mean, it's its own purposeful pursuit. And then there's the business side of it, which can be difficult to control and anticipate and manage, and that requires a whole other level of engagement and interest. So as long as you kind of keep those two things different, then you care more about, I think, what you're writing.
That's excellent advice. As a final thought, what is something that you would like students to experience during their time in college here, particularly at UNL?
I think, I think whatever, however they can engage with their interests. I mean, I think if you can identify what it is that really motivates you and excites you. If you can find something that just, even if there's just a shred of excitement, if there's avenues that you can follow, a university tends to be a great place to engage with different ideas and hear from different people. I mean, there are always readings going on. There are talks, there are panels, there are workshops. There's just so much activity by so many people who are excited about the work that they're doing and want to, tell others about the things that interest them. And so, and you can do your own thing too. I mean, that's another great thing about the university, is that if you see something that interests you, there's something that you want to do, don't wait for somebody else to do it and invite you along, or don't ask somebody else or pass that idea along, think that maybe it'll happen. You can just take it upon yourself to do it. So
dive right in. Yeah. That sounds great. Professor Schaffert, it's really a personal honor to be able to speak with you here today. And we're very thankful for your graciousness to join us here on BroadCAST as well.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay. Best wishes to you. Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye-bye.